So welcome to another weekly recap. I'm Philip Ingram. I'm now presenting Times Zero to Frontline, so recapping some of the stuff that I've done this week. But I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and commentate frequently on all matters geopolitical, defence, security and other things. We've got some fantastic videos for you this week. The first one that I want you to have a look at is Donald Trump with the El Salvadorian president, but this is where Donald Trump comes out with a statement saying Zelensky started the war.
But that's a war that should have never been allowed to start. And Biden could have stopped it, and Zelensky could have stopped it, and Putin should have never started it. Everybody's to blame.
Have you spoken to President Zelensky, sir, about his offer to purchase more Patriot missile batteries?
Oh, I don't know. He's always looking to purchase missiles, you know. He's against... Listen, when you start a war, you got to know that you can win the war, right? You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people give you some missiles. All I can do is try and stop it. That's all I want to do. I want to stop the killing. And I think we're doing well in that regard. I think you'll have some very good proposals very soon. That war started. There was no way that war should have been allowed to happen. And Biden should have stopped it, and you take a look at Putin. I'm not saying anybody's an angel, but I will tell you, I went 4 years and it wasn't even a question. He would never, and I told him, don't do it. You're not going to do it. And it was the apple of his eye, but there was no way that he would have done it.
Everyone and anyone who understands where this war came from knows that Zelensky didn't start it at all. It was purely Vladimir Putin. And as Vladimir Putin taken an opportunistic move, having tested Ukraine and tested Europe's resolve on so many occasions beforehand. And I think the reason why Putin chose to go at this stage was, if you think 3 years back, the EU and the UK were not in a good position because of Brexit, and Putin thought that that was something that would cause real difficulties. The West, including the United States, were still licking their wounds from what had happened in Afghanistan and the debacle of the withdrawal from Kabul. And Trump was out of office, but still in the background, causing political disruption in the United States and making his noises about running for a second time. And Putin will have then assessed that all of the different countries around the world would be inwardly focused and licking their wounds and trying to look out what they were doing and wouldn't react to him going in and taking Ukraine or attempting to take Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin planned his 10-day special military operation. And I think as at today, we're on day 1,150 something as we go through. Not what Putin had expected. Putin has failed strategically. He has failed to overthrow the Zelensky government, to put a puppet government in place, and to have Ukraine being run like Belarus as a puppet state to increase Putin's reach, to increase Putin's empire. He's trying to empire build with him at the centre of it. And he's tried to then shift his main effort from removing the Zelensky government and therefore taking control of the whole of Ukraine to the east, to capturing the Donbass region and the different areas there. And with the second largest military capability in the world, he's failed at that. He's failed to gain air superiority. He's failed to capture significant territories on the ground and hold those. And the Ukrainians, a much smaller force, has held him back. And this is what we're discussing today in the three clips that I urge you to watch. The first one from General Sir Richard Sharif, who was Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO, and my old boss in the past in a NATO headquarters, a land component core headquarters, and he talks a lot of sense. He's understands Russia better than many, and he talks an awful lot of real sense when it comes to the military strategic position and the weaknesses that there are within Russia and the difficulties that Russia has in trying to prosecute its operations in Ukraine. And the way Ukraine is has been able to and is continuing to attack Russia's centre of gravity. He goes on to raise questions about the logic behind some of the political decision making that we're seeing in the United States in particular and elsewhere. But there's a common thread coming through all three of these.
Frankly, Putin is making a monkey out of Trump. We've seen he completely ignored the proposal for a 30-day unilateral ceasefire. He completely ignored the proposal for a stay of bombardment of energy facilities. He launched his first attacks within hours of that being so-called agreed. And there's absolutely no indication of any truce in the Black Sea, not least because there's no way that Europe and the West will sign up to the lifting of sanctions, which Putin has demanded.
And, those attacks in Ukraine do continue. Over the weekend, there were around 40 casualties, probably more, I believe, in Russian strikes on cities in Ukraine. We were talking about support from Europe. Is there anything that Europe could do now to bolster Ukraine's air defences?
Yes, it absolutely could. It should implement the Sky Shield initiative, under which it would see some 140 aircraft from Europe based outside Ukraine, establishing an integrated air protection zone over West Ukraine and being ready to shoot down Russian drones and Russian ballistic missiles. And that would send a very strong signal to Putin. It would also be a real example of proper support for Ukraine. And frankly, every time an outrage such as happened in Sumy the other night, it takes place, there is an enormous amount of hand-wringing and talk. And we come back to my earlier point. Until and unless the West, Russia, Europe, Canada, and America understand and recognize that the only way Russia is going to stop this behavior is if it is defeated on the battlefield. And that means a clear announcement by Europe that is the intent. And the intent must be to give Ukraine the means to defeat Russia on the battlefield. And that means not only equipment and ammunition in large quantities, it means support with training and with organization and the whole 9 yards. But it also means real sacrifices from European countries, because we will have to dig really deep in order for that to happen. But we can do so. The combined European GDP is 4 times that of Russia. With sacrifice and with energy and with leadership, we could absolutely do that. And we could force the Russians to recognize that they will never achieve their aims in Ukraine and recognize that they've got to stop.
And the Americans certainly do seem worried about an expansion of this conflict, though. It's part of the reason, at least they say it's part of the reason, that they really don't want to become involved. They don't want boots on the ground in this situation. France and Britain, who would presumably have to lead any effort like that, are also nuclear powers as well as Russia. Is there not a risk of the conflict expanding, or have we kind of got past that now?
There is a real risk of the conflict expanding if Russia isn't stopped. And I keep coming back to this point, that the only way you stop Russia is to defeat them on the battlefield. Russia only respects strength. Where Russia sees weakness, Russia will continue to probe, to push, to chance its arm, as it is doing at the moment. And that raises real risks of the conflict expanding. If Russia is seen to get away with a ceasefire that favors Russia, all that is going to happen is that Putin will rebuild his armed forces, retrain his armed forces, re-equip his armed forces, and at some stage in the future, he will have another go at completing the work in Ukraine. Inevitable, absolutely inevitable, because Russia cannot countenance Ukraine as a separate, independent, sovereign state. Russia cannot see itself as a proper country unless it is an empire which includes Ukraine. So they'll try again. The way to stop that is strength. The way to stop that is to hammer Russia. The way to stop it is to support Ukraine defeating Russia. And that's the way we prevent wider conflict. And we also have to recognize that there will never be transatlantic peace, European peace and security, unless and until what I've said about defeating Russia happens, and Ukraine is included in the NATO alliance as a NATO member, And the NATO alliance puts together a band of deterrent steel from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea to make sure that there can be no resurgence of Russia.
The next clip is from Bill Browder, or Sir William Browder, I should refer to him properly, but Bill is an old friend of the show, and he gets into the political understanding of what's making Vladimir Putin tick, and the real financial difficulties that Russia is in. And Bill understands Russia from a political perspective and from an economic perspective better than virtually anyone else around the world, I think. But his understandings and explanations are very clear indeed. And again, he suggests that Russia is close to collapse.
Oil is the mainstay, the lubricant that allows Russia to continue to fight the war. The oil price, because of these tariff wars, has dropped. It's dropped a good 15 to 20%. And we're now talking about around $51 per barrel for Urals, which is the Urals crude, which is the type of oil that Russia sells. And that's far below the level that Russia is comfortable operating at. And if these oil prices were to stay this low for long or go lower, we could end up seeing Russia going into a real economic catastrophe. And if they do that, then Putin is just less able to continue to execute the war the way he's been doing it.
But we're seeing Putin at the same time. We've talked of the West's access to the U.S. defense industrial base. Russia's defense industrial base clearly isn't up to it. What level of corruption is there still within that? And we're seeing Russia having to get closer to China, to North Korea, to Iran. And I saw recent estimates that up to 80% of Russia's artillery ammunition is coming from North Korea, proving that it can't sustain its own manufacturing. And we've got the reports of Chinese soldiers being captured in the front line. And in fact, in a press conference last night run by the Ukrainians, the two Chinese soldiers turned around and said that the Russians had tried to kill them with chemical weapons rather than let them be captured. These are all signs of desperation. Is Putin that desperate? And what do you think Xi Jinping will be getting out of this from Russia? What's the debt that's going to be there, and the likelihood of him then having to call that in at some stage in the future?
Well, I would say that Russia is in a very desperate situation. If you look at the Ukrainian estimates, they've lost around 940,000 soldiers, either to death or disability, 11,000 tanks, 45,000 vehicles. I mean, not to mention $300 billion of foreign exchange reserves being frozen abroad and other terrible things from their perspective. None of these things would be acceptable in any type of situation where the leader was accountable in any way. So Putin is an unaccountable leader. He's not worried about the people, the voters of Russia. He's not worried about the parliament. He's not worried about the press. He's not worried about the laws. He's totally unaccountable. And therefore, even though he's in a desperate situation and the losses that they've incurred are completely, in a democratic country, we couldn't have sustained 1/100th of their losses without the people kicking out the leader. But he can carry on running his country into the ground for a lot longer, as long as he's able to keep his grip on power. And so far, he's been able to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be some totally unexpected moment where it all comes undone. But we can't bank on that. We can't predict that. And we can't operate and make our plans on that basis, because that might never happen. Look at North Korea. The Kim family has been around for 3 generations. And so, sometimes dictators fall and sometimes they don't. As far as China is concerned, China is loving this. They're just licking their lips right now. They're getting cheap oil. The Russians have to sell them oil at a discount. They're getting markets that the Westerners have stopped selling into. You can't buy an iPhone in Moscow. And so the Chinese are selling their phones in and their cars and all this kind of stuff. And perhaps most of all, China, who is an enemy of democracy, is watching all these democracies having to dig deep into their pockets and expend valuable resources helping the Ukrainians. And the Chinese can just sit there and smile as the dictatorships, score a point and the democracies have to lose a point.
Do you think the Chinese are manipulating the Russians to try and create instability, to take focus away from what they're doing in Southeast Asia? And do you think China is actually, in the same way they have done through Africa, um, effectively buying big chunks of Russia, buying chunks of Russian natural resources that, if there is a collapse of the Russian Federation, China will then want to go and protect?
Well, it's just up. It's only upside for China. The whole situation of Russia at war. If it doesn't go well for Russia, China can hoover up the pieces. If it goes well for Russia, it's a win for dictatorships. In the meantime, there's all sorts of money to be made, and just like with Africa, they don't have to expend any valuable resources of their own, and they end up with all sorts of influence that they're getting that we're not. And so this is definitely a win for China, except if Ukraine were to prevail. If Ukraine prevails, then it looks pretty terrible for China in their ambitions to take over Taiwan. And so, the only thing that they're scared about is the West cohesive enough so that it would respond robustly if they were to go after Taiwan. And so this is kind of a litmus test for the Chinese to see how we're behaving towards Ukraine. And of course, if the United States abandons Ukraine, that's a good sign for China going after Taiwan.
And then we get into General Ben Hodges. And General Ben was the commander of US Army Europe and has done an awful lot around in supporting activities into Ukraine and in different multinational and international think tanks and elsewhere, and is an expert on the military bit. And him and I get into a discussion about the tactics that are going on and looking at how the Russians are behaving on the front line, how the Ukrainians are working at an operational level. And he's both complimentary of some of the tactics that are being used by the United States, but he's also equally critical about some of the political activities that are going on and the impressions that will be giving the Russians in particular whenever it comes to getting ready for negotiations. But the common thread between all three of the clips that I'm urging you to watch today is that the Russians are hurting. They're hurting politically. However, they're managing to manipulate those that are interacting with them with regard to potential peace agreements or ceasefires. They're playing Witkoff, they're playing Rubio, they're playing J.D. Vance, and by all of that, they're playing Donald Trump. They are wary, I think, of Europe and how the EU has come together, but how this coalition of the willing is coming together. But again, see an opportunity to try and create fractures and cracks within there. Russia's suffering economically. And the drop in the international oil price, as Bill Browder brings out, will impact Russia more than we think. And that's impacting its ability to continue to prosecute operations. And then when we get on to General Ben, we get into that understanding of how Russia has effectively failed on the front line, how military tactics are evolving so much whenever we've got new technologies that are coming in. But it's not just evolving the Ukrainian side, the Russians are evolving as well. But the Ukrainians are coming together slightly better. And we get this understanding of Russia's ability to continue to fight the war, not just at the tactical level, but the bit that supports that tactical level, which we describe as the operational level. So if you want some insights into military doctrinal terminology, watch my interview with General Ben.
First, just look at where we are now. The United States I don't think we've had another aid package approved since the Biden administration. So there's no new U.S. stuff coming in. And I don't anticipate that this administration is going to do anything different unless the president gets really, really angry and annoyed with Vladimir Putin, who's making him look foolish. And I think the president, that's the last thing he wants, is to be seen as a loser. And so, he's capable of hard left turns, hard right turns, or complete reversals. And so he may change his mind, but I don't see that happening right now. So even without U.S. help, Ukraine and with the help of European countries, they've stopped Russia. Now, here's a couple of assumptions from my side. Number one, it's obvious that the Kremlin has zero interest in a real negotiated outcome where Ukraine survives as a sovereign nation, or even the idea of Ukraine as a sovereign nation survives. They have no interest in that. And as long as Vladimir Putin is alive, he's not going to go along with that unless he is forced to. So there's going to have to be something that will compel him to come to the table in a meaningful way. And that means he would have to recognize that Europe is really strongly united, and that the Europeans, include plus Canada, probably are committed to helping Ukraine actually, if not win, at least be in a much stronger position. And when you add together the economies and the populations and the military of all of Europe's countries, plus including Great Britain and Canada, it dwarfs Russia. I mean, I'm sick and tired of hearing this whining coming from European countries about, we can't do this without the U.S. Nonsense. The only thing that's missing is some self-confidence from our European allies. Now, so the other assumption is that Ukraine is not going to accept any outcome, regardless of what the U.S. and Russia may decide. Ukraine is not obligated to do any of that, nor is UK or any other country. So I think we have to look at this in three sort of phases. Phase one is where we are now. This is the preparation phase. And I have to give credit to President Stubb of Finland. I heard him use this framework at the Munich Security Conference, and it helped me appreciate things. The first phase is the preparation phase. That's all this stuff that's going on in Brussels, in London, in Paris, in Kyiv, in Riyadh, in the Oval Office. They're not all joined up, but they're all activities that are trying to get to a ceasefire and some kind of force that could compel Russia to comply with a ceasefire. The Ukrainians know that the Russians cannot be trusted at all. Zero. So they're not going to be willing to negotiate anything until they see that Russia will comply with a ceasefire that is enforced and backed up by European countries. So phase one is preparation. Phase two is the ceasefire, which will include the deployment of some kind of ceasefire implementation force, not a peacekeeping force, a ceasefire implementation force, something that you would recognize from 1995 when the NATO IFOR went into Bosnia. And then the third phase, those would be the actual negotiations about the long-term outcome, the sovereignty of Ukraine, whether or not sanctions are lifted on Russia, peace, security guarantees for Ukraine, those kind of things. That's months away. That's months away, assuming that UK and France and hopefully Germany and others will finally rediscover their strategic backbone and the political will necessary to put together a ceasefire implementation force that has unity of command, robust rules of engagement, and the capabilities required to deter Russia from violating a ceasefire.
So how do you see this coalition of the willing coming together, and what do you think they're going to be doing on the ground? Which is a very unfair question to ask when we don't have a peace agreement. But to my mind, it ranges from just taking the training packages that we're giving to the Ukrainians in different countries and bringing that into Ukraine so that we've got a presence on the ground, through to some form of monitoring force that could be watching what's going on. But at the same time, we get, and I don't know whether you saw General Kellogg's plan, that seemed to split Ukraine up into different regions, where there was effectively a coalition of the willing region, there was a Ukrainian region, and then the whole of the east seemed to be shaded as something that the Russians would get control, and therefore it was almost seemed to be, and it may be misinterpreting what he was putting down, but seemed to be giving the Russians everything that they wanted without them having to fight for it.
Yeah, General Kellogg's, what is attributed to him was a total dog's breakfast. I mean, who the hell is he to offer to give up Ukrainian territory? And I don't understand why this administration their start point is giving up Ukrainian territory. I mean, that has never made sense to me. And I mean, look, Russia, after 11 years, they still only control about 19% of Ukrainian territory. With every advantage, they still only control 19% of Ukrainian territory. The Great Black Sea Fleet has a really cool name. It is nowhere in sight. The Russian Air Force, with all of its technical advantages and numerical superiority, has failed the two most important tasks for any Air Force: air superiority and interdiction of the other side's lines of communication. They have not destroyed a single train or convoy bringing equipment and ammunition from Poland into Ukraine in 3 years. So I don't understand why the start point for the administration is Ukraine has to give up territory. For what? And so, to your very fair question, what would we want this ceasefire implementation force to do? First of all, we have to assume that Russia is really probably not going to agree to a ceasefire outright. Lavrov has said from the beginning, no European troops in Ukraine. Who is he? Ukraine is a sovereign country. And we should quit acting like these guys. These are the old Soviet Union with massive formations, and they're going to crush the rest of us. That's not going to happen. They can't defeat Ukraine. And so this is where I think we need to demonstrate. I mean, this is Europe's moment because of the failure of the U.S. This really is Europe's moment to demonstrate that it is no longer a vassal of the United States and that it has capability, or it never will. I mean, that's all there is to it. And so I think that we need a force that is capable of deterring Russia, and the Russians will test it immediately. But Captain Hodges there, I need to have the authority.
I commend you to all three this week. Thank you for watching Recap. I'm Philip Ingram. If you want further updates, please go to and tune into Times Radio. And if you want written updates, of course, you've got thetimes.com.